ماذا لو أن الكفاءات الجزائرية من كافة أنحاء العالم تجتمع معاً؟ ماذا لو أن هذه الأدمغة بمختلف تخصصاتها تتكاثف لتطوير التعليم والبحث العلمي للنهوض بالجزائر في مختلف المجالات؟ هل تعتقد أن هذا مستحيل؟ أبداً، فالحلم يتحول إلى حقيقة من خلال الشبكة العالمية للعلماء الجزائريين إيناس. رغم أن إيناس هي مؤسسة غير ربحية وتعتمد فقط على تبرعات الأفراد، إلا أنها استطاعت أن تبني جسوراً من التعاون وتبادل الخبرات بين أبناء وطننا الحبيب من الداخل ومن مختلف بلدان العالم، ساعية لصقل المهارات واحتواء المواهب وتبادل الخبرات وإيصال التجارب النافعة لخدمة الوطن.
All right. Good morning or good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us in another webinar, our last webinar of this year of the project Earthquake Hazard Mitigation. I am Mohammed Amrouche. I am the initiator of this initiative, the moderator of this initiative, and for this month we are very honored and pleased to have Dr. Ceri Nunn to sharing with us a very, very special lecture. Good morning, Dr. Ceri. Thank you very much for accepting
Hi,
the invitation.
And good morning, everyone who's online. I hope there's not too many football fans in the audience today.
Yes. So thank you very much. So
maybe I'll watch it later if they are. So hi.
Yeah. Exactly. Timing is really on during the semifinals now. So for this last webinar, we are really decided to have a special lecture that going to take us out of this world, and we invited Dr. Ceri Nunn from NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, GPL. So Dr. Ceri Nunn is a lunar seismologist and planetary scientist. After obtaining her PhD in seismology from the University of Cambridge, Dr. Nunn obtained a Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellowship at LMU in Munich, Germany. She joined NASA GPL in 2018 as a postdoc fellow and is now a research scientist. Dr. Ceri is now co-investigator of the Farsight Seismic Suit, a 2025 NASA mission to Schrödinger crater on the far side of the moon. The mission will deliver 2 seismometers at the far side of the moon and deploy on the deck of the CLPS lander. Dr. Ceri Nunn also uses seismology to study the structure of the moon and also using historical data from Apollo missions to learn more about the structure of the moon. And today she's going to take us to a special journey to the center of the moon. Dr. Ceri, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Hi, so thanks for inviting me. So today I want to go on this journey, the center of the moon. We're using lunar seismology to map our nearest neighbor. And as Mohammed said, I'm Ceri Nunn and I'm from Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So if you could move next slide, please. So just a quick outline. I'll start with an introduction to lunar seismology. Lunar seismology is really different from Earth seismology, and so anybody, even if you're very familiar with Earth seismology, this will be something quite new. I'm going to show a new archive of some Apollo lunar data from the original Apollo missions in the 60s and 70s, and then I'm going to talk about the Farsight Seismic Suite, which is a 2025 mission to deploy seismometers to the moon. Next slide, please. So let's start with an introduction to lunar seismology. So let's just begin with a lunar seismogram. This is a lunar seismogram. It's very typical. It's really it's quite close to the noise floor. It's a meteor impact, and I pick it because it's just not that great. It's kind of like a bit crappy, just not that great a seismogram to just kind of get a sense of what is happening on the moon. So let's just start with thinking about what it shows us. And you can see from I'll use my hand here. So there's like this long rise time. The seismogram kind of increases quite slowly, and then an even longer decay time. So you get this kind of like almost like a cigar shape. There's no distinct phases. You can't see P, you can't see S. There's no obvious later phases. In this we can see no surface waves. seismograms are generally very small magnitude, and this one it's an hour long. So this is very, very typical. And, you know, sometimes I've seen people have described this more like a sound wave, you know, that it's kind of bouncing around, and it's just, you know, like, even though it's really, really small, it's lasting for an hour. And I think that tells a couple of things, like, straight away about the moon, that we have this very, very highly scattering atmosphere, highly scattering environment, where everything is bouncing around. And I think that's very consistent with what we know about the moon. It's been bombarded by meteoroids for its entire history, and there aren't so many surface processes to close those cracks up, so you get this this bouncing around. You also must have something else, which is very low attenuation, because, you know, on Earth we'd have that signal lost in seconds. So you must have very low attenuation, and again, that's very consistent with what we know about the moon. It's, you know, it's very low in volatiles. So that's kind of telling us already kind of quite a lot about the moon just from this one not particularly great seismogram. Okay, next slide, please. So we also have different types of quakes, and these are the different, you know, some examples, some nice examples of different types of quakes. And you can see that they all have that distinctive lunar shape. They have a rise time and a decay time, and but there is some differences in the shape, and you can see that when they're all kind of put together. So the deep moonquakes tend to have a very sharp onset. The meteoroid impacts are a bit slower, and then the shallow moonquakes have a little bump at the start. So they have a lot of high frequency energy to start, and then, you know, then there's something else going on. So they kind of have this almost like a little nose cone, so it kind of sticks out and then it comes up again. And there are over 13,000 events catalogued from the Apollo seismometers, which were operating for around 8 years, different stations available at different times, but it was operating for a very long time. And we also have artificial impacts, which tend to behave very similar way to meteoroid impacts. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, deep moon quakes. Yeah, we have, so yeah, as I said before, you have this quite sharp onset. These are the most numerous events. They are very, they tend to be very small. They have this steep rise time, and you can't always see distinct P and S arrivals. Next slide, please. So we have, so they're estimated to be very, very deep, actually. They might be around 800 kilometers deep. And so that's halfway to the center of the moon. So this is, you know, these really are deep. They're probably triggered by tides, and they certainly have a lot of relationship to the tides. We can't see exactly how they're triggered or exactly why they're triggered at different points in the tidal cycle, but they do seem to have some association with the tides. And then something which is crazy about them is that they have very similar waveforms from different events. And so the seismograms can be stacked. And when you look at them kind of in this sort of, you know, this is over 120 minutes, it looks impossible to stack them, but, you know, they really do stack. And so there's this very similar waveform. And so this leads to a theory called of the deep moonquake stacks, where you have these nests of moonquakes which are kind of coming from a particular location. They're always coming from the same place at the same time, and so, you know, it's just one way of explaining why you get such similar waveforms in, you know, in like, even though they look like this. Okay, next slide, please. Then we have meteoroid impacts. We have a lot of them. You know, there's nothing much, you know, there's nothing to stop them, so they hit the moon very hard. But even so, they tend to be quite small. Sometimes, like in this case, you can actually see the first direct arrival or the P wave, and so you can sometimes see that. Next slide. Then the shallow moonquakes. As I mentioned before, they have that kind of quite distinctive shape with a little kind of bump at the start, and then it suddenly increases later on. There seems to be 28 of these events. They tend to be larger magnitude. what's interpreted, that kind of second bump is interpreted as a shear wave energy coming in, and they're estimated to be around 30 to 100 kilometers depth. So kind of they're not super shallow, or at least we think they're not super shallow. They're probably sitting below the crust. That kind of explains the pattern. That's the best way of explaining the pattern of them. Okay, next slide. And finally, the artificial impacts, which are like, this is basically what happens if you try to impact a Saturn IV booster into the moon. You get this huge, like basically a massive crater, and you get, there are 9 of these events. And they're really valuable because we know the locations and the trajectory and a lot more about them. So they're a really great way of calibrating the rest of our models. And to, you know, basically they look like large meteoroid impacts, which is very similar to what they are. Okay, next. So now I'd like to just zoom in a bit, and you know, the picture on the left is the artificial impact over 120 minutes, and so it has this rather neat shape. You know, it's kind of like there's a kind of, you know, if you were plotting the envelope, it would be very neat. But once you start really zooming in, some of that structure seems lost. And so where by the time you move over to the picture on the right, there is no obvious particular phases or particular shape. When you're looking at a whole, it's gradually increasing, but that's not particularly true if you really zoom in. And so there's quite a lot of there's probably quite a lot of random structure near the surface, which is kind of playing into this. And also obviously you're scattering again, so getting you know, some kind of like interfering patterns. So I think it's worth bearing in mind that when you really zoom in, that you kind of lose some of that kind of very nice envelope structure of what you're thinking about. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so the moonquakes occur in very distinct regions of the moon. We've kind of already touched on that. So the Apollo stations were all on the near side, and that affects kind of how we can see and what we can see within the moon. The shallow moonquakes are pretty close to the surface, probably sitting just under the crust. And then we have another group of deep moonquakes, which are halfway to the center of the core. And then the meteoroid impacts, obviously, they'll be impacting on the outside. So we are getting these very different, distinct regions of the moon which are being activated. Next slide. And I think also the other thing which we certainly think about the moon is that it's differentiated into crust, mantle, and core. So it has some similarities with Earth on that regard, and it possibly, you know, it has a possible lower mantle partial melt. So we've got this. We also have this region near the edge where the scatter seems to be very, very important, where there's probably a lot more scatter and maybe a bit more heterogeneity, which is causing that scatter. So we are getting, there's kind of a lot of differences between different parts of the moon. And yes, it's crust, mantle, core. There's no lower mantle on the moon as far as we can tell, that's equivalent to Earth, but apart from that we have something similar, and a liquid core. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so these are some velocity models, and I think one of the first things, so these are seismic velocity models, and one of the first things to notice is that there are very low velocities near the surface. You know, 100 meters a second in the top 4 meters is very typical, but you get this very strong gradient in the crust. So even though it's very low to start with, by the time you get further down, it's becoming a bit more normal. So you have this very strong gradient in the crust. And then near the top of the mantle, maybe 7.6 to 8.2 kilometers a second. And the mantle seems to be quite, there's no obvious, it's much less graded than you know, Earth, for example. So once you're in, you kind of go, you sort of drop straight through, as far as we know. And then these models, and I think any model you could care to take from Apollo, are very poorly constrained near the core, just because the data just don't sample that part properly. And so if you want to start thinking about the core, one of the things you have to do is think about what are the, you know, what's the minerals, what's self-consistent with the thermodynamic modeling. So people have been trying different methods to understand what's happening near the core, but they are not actually constrained by the seismic data at all. Next slide. So the one thing I'd also like to say is that the seismic velocity models do not necessarily show strong discontinuities. We, like some of the original models, had very, very sharp discontinuities, and I think that's more to do with how you had to parameterize your models, you know, when these models were first run. There's nothing necessarily in the data which are supporting that. We see there may be much more gradients, and to be honest, we don't know exactly, we don't know how sharp those boundaries are, and we don't know exactly where they are. So those are some things which we're interested in finding out. Okay, next slide, please. So and then I'd also like to say a caveat, you know, when you read a catalogue of lunar data, there will be a location, and it will often be, you know, it will be a place on the moon. But this is I think this is a really nice paper which shows kind of how poorly some events can be. So these are deep moonquake nests, and we sort of, you know, we quote a location for them. But this paper, you know, the authors show that, you know, some of those events just could be pretty much anywhere on the moon. So A104 is kind of, you know, could be anywhere, and it would still fit with the observations. And I think this isn't just true for deep moonquake nests, it's often true for all kinds of seismic events on the moon, that, you know, it's not always clear which phases we're dealing with. And so if you don't know exactly what phase you're dealing with, then it's very difficult to, you know, it's difficult to get a location, and it's very difficult to quantify its uncertainty. So I think that's a really good caveat for anybody who's interested in using seismic data on the moon. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so I've already talked a bit about the scatter, and I think this is a really nice picture of the kind of paths that the energy can take through the moon. And so if you look at the red line, the direct waves are dropping through the crust, moving through the mantle, and then coming back up to the seismic station. But that's not the only path you can take, and there are many, many paths. And if there is some heterogeneity or some scatter within the subsurface, then you can take many, many different paths. And what's probably happening is that you're you know, bouncing around. So there may be some kind of, you know, you're hitting a layer and then coming back up, and then, you know, keep going, and you may end up in some completely different layer. So there's a lot of, and that kind of blue line just shows really random structure. And so when you put the whole thing together, you perhaps get that slightly neat shape that we've seen already, that you get this kind of like slow rise time and long decay time. But the individual path is, you know, as far as I'm concerned, kind of all bets are off really as to where things have gone. And so that scattered energy, unfortunately, like, it's very interesting in and of itself, but it often obscures many signals of interest. So for example, if we're interested in the crust mantle or the core mantle boundary, that becomes like a major problem for lunar seismologists, that we just don't really know. You know, it's very hard to see those signals, and trying to kind of back them out and start thinking about how to stack them, but that's not always easy. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so the next section is some work that I did to provide a new archive of Apollo lunar data. You can go on to the next slide. Okay. So there was the problem. This is something that I started researching when I was in Munich, and it was really difficult to get started on using lunar data. You'd sort of ask somebody, and then they'd ask, they'd ask their friend, and then they'd almost dig in their garage. There was these data were copied from reel-to-reel tapes. They were in a proprietary format. There were some issues with the timing, which I'll talk about later, which are intrinsic to the data. There's no real way of getting around that problem. There was also a really nice version from IGP, which was the easiest version to use, but it was pre-processed and it had these timing errors in it, and you couldn't back those out. And there was another version from JAXA, the Japanese Aerospace Agency, but they, unfortunately, they also were unable to account for the timing problems. So this is where I started. I needed to know what the timing was doing. So I started working on this project, and then I ended up sharing it because I hope it might be useful to other people. So next slide, please. So these data are archived at IRIS. The network code is XA, which I think stands for extraterrestrial. So it's also at the Planetary Data System. And if you try the Getting Started page on the GitHub site, that's got some useful information about how to use it and how to get started. And those are the references there if anyone's interested. So next slide, please, and I'll show you some of the getting started. Okay, so this is the getting started page. You just go here and you can start. There's some examples of how to use it and how to download it. So next slide, please. So one thing I would say, we had some problems with some of the data, especially the short period, is actually missing samples. Like if there's 60 samples, then it's missing a handful of them, and every time it's missing them. So Miniseed was not very happy with trying to, basically have these really short seismograms. So I ended up putting in -1 as a number. So if your seismogram looks like this is not, you don't even have to worry about this. These -1 numbers are just, they're just in to hold the spaces. So you can replace it with nothing, or you can interpolate over it, whatever you want to do yourself. But if you go on to the next slide, this is what the seismogram looks like once you've done that. So, and there's a little bit of a few snips of code in there just to show you how to do it. But just don't panic if you see the seismograms like that. They're not that lopsided. It's just like a technical way of getting around the problem of these really short sampling intervals. Okay, so yeah, so that's also, this particular thing will show you how to the instrument respond and get a reasonable lunar seismogram using these data. Okay, next slide, please. This is the data availability. So it covers the passive, this archive covers the passive data, which is Apollo 11, 12, 14, 15, and 16. And you'll see one of the cool things about this is that after, like, I think it's about in March or so, 1972, you can actually get data from all 4 stations for some of the time. So that's really cool. It's like basically a network operating the moon until the end of the mission. Next slide, please. And I've already mentioned this issue with that we have, there's this issue with the timing. And the timing is a problem where the data sampler itself was not sampling at constant intervals. And so what you have is, it varies, but only by a very small amount. But it was very difficult to put it into something like SEED. So what I did was just include that timing track with the rest of the data. So if you want to plot the timing track, it's in there. And in many cases, you will need to do it, because if you move on to the next slide, please. What you'll find is that because there's a slightly varying timing over, say, 24-hour period, you get some divergence between what the the timing, what the sample time is, and the actual timestamp, and that varies slightly between the different stations. And so if you had, say, an event in the late in the evening, the timing is slightly off by a few seconds, so you have to correct for that. But that information is in the timestamp, and again, there's a few snippets of code to show you how to do that, or not even how to do that, but just an example of how to do that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, yeah, so my final session today is to talk about the Farside Seismic Suite with the PI of Mark Hanning, who's at JPL. And if you move on to the next slide, please. So the target for the mission is Schrödinger Basin, which is this rather beautiful basin. It's an impact basin with a peak ring in the middle, so you've got those mountains on the inside of the ring. It has some similarities with Chicxulub crater, dinosaur-killing impact, but is much better preserved. And it's of a similar scale, so it's 120 kilometers diameter. The peak ring is 150 kilometers, and then that peak ring is 2.5 kilometers high, and 3.8 billion years old. So that's kind of quite old, but quite young for the moon. And then the Schrödinger, it's our Farside Seismic Suite is going where this arrow is sitting, so it's on the outer ring. And yeah, we should be able to look at some seismology of this area on the far side. Next slide, please. So it's all the way around onto the far side. It's 75 degrees south, and yeah, it's sitting just where the arrow is. Next slide, please. And yes, it's we're going to be able to take two seismometers. It's a VBBZ and something called an SSP, and they will both sit on the deck of the commercial lander. Both of these instruments are flight proven. They have been sitting on InSight on Mars, so we know that they work exceptionally well, and that we're also hoping that to a certain extent we may be able to have slightly quieter noise conditions on the moon. So this is really, really great. Yeah, we have a commercial lander chosen from Draper, and yeah, I think yeah. So the VBB, just a single component, is a single it's a Z component, and then we also have a slightly less sensitive short period instrument. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about the objectives that we have. So the first of our objectives is whether the seismicity is different on the far side. And as I've already mentioned, the stations are all on one side of the moon. They're all on the near side. And so that obviously controlled what we could see and where the data were coming from. And so I suspect that at the moment our pattern of seismicity on the moon is very kind of lopsided. And I suspect that when we look at the other side, it will no longer be. And it was just a function of where the stations were. But this is a really great way of testing it, that we can look at the difference between the seismicity on the near side and the far side. But I also think, kind of on top of that, this is like the first order thing, which I think there will be a lot more symmetry. We do know that there is asymmetry in the moon, and so we know that we know, for example, that the crust is very different on the near side to the far side. We know, and so maybe these differences, what we don't know is how kind of deep they are, whether, for example, it affects the core, and whether there's a lot of difference between near side and far side, and that's something which we can look at from the far side. So that's really exciting to be able to go there. Next slide, please. The second thing, as I've kind of already alluded to, this is an impact basin that's very well preserved, and so we're interested in how that shapes the crust and any structure that we can see within it. We only have, have these two seismometers in the same location, so And I would definitely expect, if you look at this paper here, which is referenced, of this rather beautiful shape to the structure of the basin, if you follow the videos on that in this paper, the impact processes are so dramatic that you get this huge kind of variation in, there's like a lot of structure, a lot of faulting, a lot of, melt production immediately. And so things are overturning. You can see, you can see that on the picture here. So there will be a lot of very complicated structure, and I would be I'd be very pleased, but I'd be quite surprised if we could pick out a lot of that. But we should be able to get some of the first order constraints, like, for example, the thickness of the crust here. So those are things which we're interested in, and look also at the shallow structure just beneath this, beneath our little section of the outer ring. So that's our second objective. Next slide, please. I think I've explained all of that, sorry. Oh yes, just one, sorry, can you go back to slide? Yeah, just one slight point about that is that with the Grail data, so we have an understanding of the global moon and how thick the average crust is, but at the moment we're actually using only one data point, which is from Apollo 12 and 14, which are quite close to each other. And so by adding this extra constraint, we're adding quite a lot really to that kind of understanding of the whole global model. Yeah, next slide, please.
Thank you, Ceri. I just wanted to add maybe one comment. Grail data stands for the gravity data, right?
Yes, yes, sorry. Yeah. And then finally, objective 3 is we're looking at the current micrometeorite impact rate driving the lunar seismic harm. So we know that there's background, there's going to be a lot of very small meteor impacts, and so these, there's nothing to stop them, there's no atmosphere, so they have this huge range in size, and that they will be constantly raining down on the area around the seismometer. And so we should be able to monitor it lower. The VBBZ will be recording at lower northern Apollo, and we can better constrain that impact rate, which I think is very useful for understanding, what's happening in the whole of the solar system, because, this is one of our prime places for constraining it. So that's really cool. And then on top of that, it's a long-term human safety goal, because we do need to know, understand the character of that meteoroid impact rate, and what's happening, what kind of size is hitting any human structures. Okay, next one. Yeah, so I also wanted to talk about the noise floor of the seismometers. So on the left is the projected performance for the moon, and if we do, so this is we're looking at over different frequencies of the spectral density of various different events. And so the orange line is the largest event that was recorded on the Apollo seismometers. And then the dashed grey line is the lowest noise ever recorded on the Apollo seismometers. And so you can see there's a range which isn't actually that big between the smallest thing we ever saw and the largest thing we ever saw. So we want to, on this plot, we want to be as low as possible. We want our instruments to fall, preferably, hopefully even below that line, but the lower the better. And so what we don't know about Apollo, we obviously know what the smallest we managed to record was, but what we don't know is whether that was just the instrument floor, and then you basically couldn't get anything better than that, or whether there's a bit more, whether the noise can sometimes be a bit lower than that, and therefore you get, when you do see signal, you can see it more clearly. And we don't know whether this grey line is the correct one, or whether we're going to end up, hopefully we're going to bring that noise level down at least some of the time. So, so as you know, as I put in, the VBB requirement is quite low on that plot. Our current estimation of the VBB is the blue line, so it's sitting just below the requirement. And then for the SP, maybe we're still working on exactly where that's going to fall, because we need to make some changes to that instrument to make sure that it works on the moon. And then just for comparison, there's the bit on the right, the plot on the right shows a low noise on the SP, which is when the SP was on its way to Mars. It was in a very, very quiet environment, and it was operating then. And then the blue line is a good day on Mars when there's not much wind. So we hopefully be a little bit below that, but you know, obviously these things have to be tested, and up to a point we can only test them when we're there. So, but in theory, the VBB-Z will be more sensitive than Apollo, and then yeah, the SSP hopefully should be more sensitive than Apollo, above 1 Hertz. Okay, next slide, please. So let's just think about some of the sources of environmental noise that become really important. The magnetic noise turns out not to be that important, luckily. The VBB-Z is sensitive to magnetic noise, but luckily the moon isn't in too bad a state, and so the normal position for the moon is just in the solar wind, which is quite a benign environment. For a few days a month, it's in the S magnetotail, and then there's a few critical hours where it crosses the bow shock, and so that for those few hours you would expect quite a significant amount of magnetic noise. Then we have the tilt noise. So we're thinking about a vertical component instrument, and that there's the stationary tilt, where if your instrument is tilted slightly, you start sampling some of the horizontal noise. And the horizontal noise on the moon is certainly for Apollo instruments, and probably in reality was much higher than the vertical noise. So that's the first problem. And secondly, there's the tilt as things change, that there's some kind of differences on each of the feet, and that can couple into the instrument, and so you end up with some tilt noise. And finally, not finally, there's many sources of environmental noise, but another section of environmental noise we've been thinking about is the thermal noise, and that is again, the instrument itself is sensitive to temperature, and that changes the sensor and its ability to record the size. Basically it changes its acceleration. So we will be putting the instruments in a thermal box, and so we should be able to mitigate some of that, but this is potentially quite a large problem, especially where the temperature variations are so high. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so we can think about some of the best cases. So the best case for the magnetic noise is when we're sitting in the solar wind. The best case for the tilt is when there's no difference on the feet and there's zero tilt altogether. And then the thermal noise, the best case is when it's cold, that has the least effect on the seismometer. And then there's some differences, different times of day, different times of month may affect that. So yeah, so that's the best case. So if we move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so if we just concentrate on the best case, which is always good, we start with, so the purple line is where we think the instrument noise is. It's not super easy to always to measure that because of differences between the Earth and the Moon, but this is where we think the instrument noise is. And so if we start with the least problematic source of noise, that's the blue line, which is the magnetic noise, that in the best case, the magnetic noise is not having much of an effect at all. the second kind of environmental noise that we need to worry about is the thermal noise, and that's not doing much in our frequencies of interest. And in the cold case, you can see that between it has its, you know, the worst effect is when it's hot, but it's, you know, it's only really hot kind of half the time. So that's again not something we need to worry about. And then we also need to think about the tilt noise, which in the best case isn't really doing anything. In the typical case, we may have some aspects of the tilt. And so when we start adding these noises up, in the best case, we're kind of hitting the requirement and we're better than Apollo. And then in the typical case, we're perhaps not quite making a requirement. But there certainly is, you know, different times of the day. You know, we do know that there was certainly a lot of variation between the noise on Apollo, and so we'd obviously expect the same thing, maybe not exactly the same response because we're using a different seismometer, but we do expect some variation in the noise. And so, and again, in the typical case, we should be pretty close to our requirement for most of the time. So that's good, and I guess we don't really know until we're there. So yeah, next slide, please. Okay, we just a quick thing about a new method to locate events, which didn't happen, which wasn't something available to Apollo, and that is that when we can now monitor impact flashes from Earth. And I don't know if you can see, I don't think I have a pointer, but if you look just above the L on the left-hand side of the moon, there is an impact flash which was recorded from Earth. So people watching, this is a lunar eclipse, people watching the lunar eclipse sitting on it, you know, from Earth, just looking in their binoculars, saw this kind of flash. And that flash, these kinds of flashes can be recorded on Earth. And of course, that gives you a very good timing, and it gives you a good location. So it's again one of those things, you know, like with Apollo, we have a handful of events that are really well calibrated. We should be able to use these types of events, which will also be very well calibrated and will be, you know, will be on the far side. So we won't get many kind of really close to us, but hopefully if there's some along the limb, then we should be able to see them. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so we're in a very extreme environment. And it's very extreme for humans, which we're obviously thinking about for Artemis, but some of those things are actually great for the instruments. So the lower gravity than Earth means that we can use slightly different components, and the instrument noise is reduced. We're operating in a vacuum, which is very good for the instrument. Again, the instrument noise is reduced. We have higher radiation than Earth, but that's not a major problem because we'll only be there for a few months. We have lunar dust, which is a major problem, but we need to seal the instrument. And then the deck deployment. We don't think it's going to be a major problem because the moon doesn't have wind. So we do know that there may be some coupling of the, you know, certain, if there's any vibration on the lander itself, there may be some coupling into that, which is potentially a problem. But hopefully at the frequencies that we're most interested in, it shouldn't be a major problem. And then the last one is temperature. If you could move on to the next slide. So the temperature is such a crazy range on the moon. I sometimes think when I wrote this down, I just thought I'd made a mistake. It's, you know, that it's going from minus 173 Celsius to 97 Celsius. So it's just this, you know, incredible 270 Kelvin range. And this is just actual measurements from Apollo 15. So this is a problem which we are dealing with. I think there's something on the next slide. Just make the next slide. Yeah, so the far-side seismic suite will have insulation to keep it warm at night, and then it's got a little kind of loop pipe at the top of its thermal box that will keep it cool during the day. So So we hope that it's got this very efficient thermal switch, which will reduce the temperature extremes, which are potentially a very large problem. Okay, next slide, please. So finally, conclusions. Next slide, please. I'd just like to thank Dr. Yoshio Nakamura, who's a legend, as we've discussed before we started. Yeah, he did his PhD with these lunar data, and he's continuing to support people who work with these data. And then many other people, many co-authors, many colleagues who've done some really important work with these data. Okay, next slide. So learning from Apollo, I hope I've shown that, you know, the Apollo instruments were actually very sensitive instruments. They were very coarsely digitized. You do sometimes get almost like a barcode. So there's nothing happening, something happens, nothing happens, something happens. And so that can, especially when you're close to the noise level, it's really difficult to work out what's going on. And that is a huge problem. But apart from that, they were very sensitive instruments. And I've also tried to show that lunar seismology is very different from terrestrial seismology. The seismic scattering is one of the most difficult problems to overcome. And that doesn't go away if we have a nicer instrument or more instruments. You know, that problem remains. So I think that's something we always need to understand when learning from Apollo. Next slide, please. Okay, and the Farsight Seismic Suite is to be launched in 2025. It's a single seismic station, but with 2 seismometers deployed on a lander and for 4 months. And then we have these 3 objectives, which are, is the seismicity different on Farsight? How do the impact processes shape the lunar crust inside and outside the crater? And what is the current rate of micrometeorite impacts? And that's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Ceri Nunn, for the very, very exciting presentation. You really take us to another dimension. I mean, especially for people working on earthquakes, having an insight on moonquakes is really a new discovery for us. I can confirm that.
Yeah, I don't like to think what would happen if it lasted for
Exactly. Thank you very much. So I think we would like to remind our audience that we are moving now to the Q&A session, and you can ask your questions in the comment section. We already have many questions on the chat here. I think we can move to the Q&A session. I will start with the first questions from Facebook. Thank you very much for the presentation. Are there any seismic recordings related to active volcanic activity on the moon?
No. So we were there for 6 years. I think, you know, if we expected, you know, if we see like fusions on the moon, then, you know, we could probably record them, but I don't know of any that are, you know, like since the 70s. You know, it's not, you know, even kind of when people get excited about recent volcanic activity, they're talking millions, if not billions of years ago. So no.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll pick another question from the audience. Let me just display it. Okay. Oh, okay, sorry, I think we are just having some display issue here. Just give me 1 minute, please. But basically the question
I'm sorry, I've lost the sound. Could you repeat it? Your sound.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Sorry about that.
Sorry for the technical problem. I had to restart the reader. So sorry, I will pick another, as I said, another question from our audience here. Okay, so the next question is, well, just give me 1 minute, please. Yeah, so the question says, in zooming in slide, there was a discontinuity in the artificial impact graph. How can we physically explain that?
Okay, we don't have to physically explain that, luckily. It's because, the data are coming from the moon. They were recorded in real time. So if there was a problem with, just picking up the data, you get these, you basically just get gaps in the transmission. And you may have seen, if anyone has used previous versions of the data, they will have just included those. And I decided to take them out. There's a little code you can check to see whether the data are correct. So I just took them out because they're just nonsense. So yeah, we don't have to worry about it. It's not, the trace is fine. Well, the trace would have been fine, but we just can't see it.
Thank you very much.
Good spot though.
Yes, thank you very much. We'll pick another question from Facebook this time. Is the friction angle on the moon similar to the Earth?
I'm sorry. I'm not. Because I deal with this. Like, I don't really deal with the faults at the moment on the moon. So I'm afraid I can't answer the question. Okay, thank you very much. We will pick another question as well. From YouTube this time. Why most of the graphs are carried out in the 70s? I think I know the answer. So there's all the data are from the 70s. So if there's any graph from now, it's been done on data from the 70s. That's yeah. Thank you very much. So sorry, I think we lost connectivity with LinkedIn, but I would just read for you the comments from my mobile. So Professor Nabil Ashuri from LinkedIn is asking, thank you, Dr. Ceri, for such interesting subject and presentation. Unfortunately, I have the time to leave and I can't finish the presentation. How can we apply? How do you measure these indicators, and how can we use such subject in mitigating risks on Earth, considering that there are some differences between both Moon and Earth? So maybe some lesson learned from lunar seismology that can be implemented in earthquake studies, for example. So is this a question about risks on Earth? I'm not quite sure I've followed, and as he's not here. Actually, the question is just if there is any learnings that we learned from lunar seismology that we can apply to mitigate earthquakes on Earth. Yeah, I think we may eventually do something about how to understand very highly scattering environments. But luckily, we don't live on a very, most of us don't live in very kind of highly scattering environments. So I think for the most part, the lessons, we don't have to worry. We don't have to worry about that length of signal. We don't have to worry about that level of kind of low attenuation. What we do have to worry about is real people on the moon at some point. And I know people are starting to look at stability of human habitats on the moon, that whether they can withstand shaking for an hour, for example, and whether there's any structures on the moon, for example, like tubes or lava pits, where you get some protection from the outside environment, but hopefully they're also stable in some kind of fairly local event, which they do seem to be because they seem very persistent. So I think, yeah, what we learned something about Moon, but luckily we don't have to worry about these particular problems on Earth. Thank you very much for the answer. Probably I can add one comment to top your answer is probably, especially for site effect studies, I myself worked on lunar seismology. The moon is deadly silent. We have no ocean, no traffic, and no noise made by human activity. So probably studying the waves on silent mode can be very interesting to understand more theory behind it. Well, I think maybe the last question. Probably I will go for one last question from our audience. So let me see if we have other questions on the chat here. So yeah, I think we have another one from LinkedIn. So thank you from Kamaradin from LinkedIn. Thank you, Doctor, for this fascinating presentation. My question is, and you do have a lot, since the moonquakes are relatively small, maybe due to the size of the moon, the strain rates are low, but sufficient to trigger small faults and fractures. Hence, can we say that the moon is thick
tectonically active?
Oh, that's a good question. It's a really nice one to finish on. I think it's a huge area of debate. I think, firstly, it seems to be the case that there's some kind of tidally triggered events deep within the moon. I think that's fairly uncontroversial. And then there's some suggestion that there may be that the shallow moonquakes, which I talked about, are a bit more shallow than I think they are. And that they are tectonically, there's some kind of movement on tectonic faults because of those. I think it's, that I think we can be certain that there's no tectonic plates, but what's probably the case is that there's some kind of relaxing, that there's, those enormous impact basins that as they do over time, there may be some kind of faults around the edge. And I think that's what's going on. But yeah, so and I think that there does seem to be two sets of processes which are not the same. There's these kind of deep processes, and then there's something going on around to the edge of these really large basins. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your answer, Dr. Ceri Nunn. So with that said, I would like to, I think we can close up the Q&A sessions. Everybody's really thanking you for the outstanding presentation. I think we learned a lot, and you successfully inspired many geoscientists here in our webinar, especially with the success of the Artemis mission. Everybody is really cheering for you guys. So thank you very much for the presentation. Yeah. I would like to thank our audience also, especially for their questions. We had a lot of questions, and for the time. I would like to recall that this is our last webinar for the earthquake hazard mitigation. I hope we successfully inspired you, and you learned a lot, especially from our different specialists. And we closed this webinar series with lunar seismology, so that can hopefully can learn things from what is being done on lunar seismology. I would like to remind our audience that the data set are available publicly. So we again thank Dr. Ceri for sharing the links. So everybody who's interested to see seismograms from the moon, from the Apollo missions, he can download them, and he can try maybe some new ideas, and why not publish some new findings that was hidden in the data for over 50 years now, right? Okay, so with that said, thank you very much, Dr. Ceri Nunn, for your time and for your preparation. And we thank our audience for attending this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.